Well, while I'm not a Trump supporter, I do believe Trump will win, not because I like him or even want him to win, but because I sense a groundswell of silent majority support for him. If my prediction is correct and he gets in for another term, what do you think the reaction will be from Democrat voters?
Greg Sheridan.
Well, Hamish, I think that's the scenario which is most likely to cause terrible civil unrest in the United States. I've got a lot of faith in the United States, the great American friendliness, the essential decency of the place. But if Biden were to win the popular vote by, say, 5%, and Trump squeaked away through the Electoral College to get a bare majority in the Electoral College, I don't think that's going to happen, but it's very possible. I think you would see massive street demonstrations. I think people would be extremely angry at the Electoral College system. They would feel that they'd been robbed and so forth. And you might get real civil discord on the streets. Trump would be unbearable in his bombast and self-justification, although I think actually he'd probably temper down and be a bit more moderate in the second term than the first.
And why do you think that's the most likely scenario in which there'd be chaos and perhaps violence, more so than a victory the other way around?
Because Trump doesn't command mass support which he can mobilise into the streets. There are some very violent, horrible, ugly people who are Trump supporters, but they're not really a mass movement. Now, if Trump loses, if Biden is ahead by 20,000 votes on the night in Michigan, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, then it's all over, Red Rover, and no court is going to steal the election for Trump. I mean, at the very most, Trump may be able to get some ballots tossed out or something like that. I think you only get conflict if you're on an absolute knife edge with a Trump loss, and then I think it would be legal conflict. But there's no indication to me that the military, the judiciary, or anybody else would do anything unconstitutional to keep Trump in Pennsylvania Avenue.
Lydia, Khalil, do you see it that way? That's the most likely scenario for chaos, violence on the streets?
Well, I want to be very careful about how I talk about the prospect of violence, because I think in a lot of ways it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If one side believes that the other side is going to resort to violence if they don't get their way, then they will be more the ready to use violence themselves. We've seen that scenario play out over and over again in any time that they have civil conflict. I think the worst outcome, the worst potential for violence would be, as Greg mentioned, a close race, a contested race, a Bush versus Gore situation. If there's a decisive victory, either way, for Trump or Biden, that is the best case scenario that we could possibly have. But because Trump, thus far, if you believe the polling, is behind, what you're going to see is a lot of the violence has actually been instigated at this instance from his supporters. The incumbent president himself has incited violence on the debate stage, which is extremely unprecedented. So if we're going to be seeing violence, it will be likely as a response to, as an instigation from some of the far-right militias, for example, Trump-supporting street gangs, and the like, in response to mass protest movements if they occur from the left.
Peter Dixon, what do you make of that? Do you think that's more likely to create violence?
Yes, I think sometimes by just talking it up, it can actually...
But Lydia's saying that it's more likely that Trump supporters would actually come out and create that.
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Why?
I think both sides have got the potential, if the talking up occurs, to do the same.
Have you heard Biden talking up violence?
Not necessarily by Biden or Trump necessarily talking up the violence, but by, I think, watching the different factions stirring up their own trouble.
OK, Damien Cave?
Yeah, I mean, here's the nightmare scenario that I think about, is the election drags on for several days in Pennsylvania, and it's the state that's going to define who wins or loses. There's a handful of poll workers working in some place counting the votes, and President Trump calls out his people and says, go to that place, we need to make sure that our votes are counted, and then you actually have unrest at a single location where the votes are being counted in a way that completely challenges the election and makes it almost impossible to even know who won or lost. That's the nightmare scenario that I worry about. There are many other ones that are possible as well. But I also think that there's a scenario that's possible where it could actually work out okay, that maybe there is a landslide victory. Maybe the results, if they're resolved in a day or two, I think Americans can be patient. If it drags on to a week or two and there's all court cases and there's a clear location where people are gathering, then I think it gets very dangerous. And I think that both sides have the potential to be violent. However, the difference is you have a president who's actually been encouraging violence on the part of his supporters, and you don't have that on the other side.
Salvatore's right, isn't he?
Oh, no. Look, I have friends in 2016 who live in university towns, and in 2016 they were organizing neighborhood self-defense units because they were convinced that the Trump brown shirts were going to come marching through their towns any day now. And of course, those marches never came. Look, I think the United States, for all of its violence that looks terrible on TV, is a much more peaceful place than people give it credit for. There will be isolated incidents somewhere in the country of 300 million people. I certainly feel bad for the people who are caught up in those isolated incidents on both sides. But there's not going to be a civil war in America, whichever way this election goes.
Kim Hoggard?
I would just add to Greg's comment and to remind him that the president won election in 2016. The day following his inauguration, we saw 1 million women march peacefully in Washington, D.C. in response to his election. I think we've seen this year an incredible amount of inflammatory commentary from the president, which resulted in a kidnapping plot against the governor of Michigan. And we could cite a number of other examples, but I don't think it's a given, and I agree completely with Lydia that we do have to be careful about how we just discuss and make assumptions about what can happen. I do think that Americans are exhausted and they want to see a peaceful outcome. But just in these few days leading up to the election, it's become so heated with actual acts of aggression, whether it's with trucks blocking bridges or trying to run cars off the road. It's all we need.
Yeah, or rioting and looting in Philadelphia.
All we need is the president just to say something calming, and we can get past this moment.
Is he capable of that? Is Trump capable of that?
Sorry?
Is Trump capable of saying something calming?
Only
Well,
if
he
it's in his
hasn't shown
self-interest.
himself to do it yet.
I mean, if he thinks it's in his self-interest to be calming, then maybe that's the case. But as he's proven for 4 years, President Trump's main interest is his own survival in politics. And so this election will be defined by what he sees is best for his campaign.